Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We human beings are fascinated by the beginning of stories. You who are parents know that all you have to do is say, "Once upon a time," and suddenly kids and others will stop and want to hear what comes next. Today we begin the new program year. Today begins the new cycle of readings from the narrative lectionary. Now every year the narrative lectionary begins at the beginning of the Bible in September, and then it runs through the Hebrew Bible, or which we sometimes call Old Testament, until we get to Christmas, and then it follows a particular gospel from then until we get to Pentecost. This year, the fourth year of the cycle, will be devoted to the Gospel of John. Now, if you're thinking, but wait, Chris, John doesn't have a birth story. Don't worry. Christmas Eve, we'll be using the Gospel of Luke's version, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. I know you were worried about that. But today we are beginning at the beginning. Now, beginnings are interesting because they hint at what is to come. They lay out the foundation that will serve for the rest of the story. So what does this story of beginnings provide us today? Now, our reading for this morning comes to us from the first book of our Bibles, the book called Genesis. Now, it probably won't surprise you to learn that Genesis is not what the book is called in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it is just the first word of the book, Bereshith, which means beginning of. Rather, our title comes from the Greek title, which means generations. And that was chosen because of the phrase at the end of our reading for this morning, "These are the generations." That phrase, "These are the generations," shows up several times at key points in the book of Genesis. And of course, as a consequence of the title of this book, we use the word Genesis to mean the beginning of something, which is appropriate since it's the first book of our Bibles, and it tells one of the stories about the beginning. Now, we don't know who wrote Genesis. Tradition ascribes authorship to Moses, but the text itself never identifies Moses as the source. In fact, the text would have to have come from a source hundreds and even thousands of years before Moses. Most scholars believe that the stories that became Genesis would have circulated in oral traditions long before being written down. And these stories would have been collected into written sources. Scholars have identified three unique layers for the book of Genesis. Sometimes these layers supplement each other, and sometimes they even contradict each other. The first chapter of Genesis deals with the creation of the heaven and earth. Now, when researching for this sermon, I found a website that listed 20 different creation stories in the Bible. Genesis 1 is only one of them. So remember that. When someone tries to tell you that Genesis 1 must be taken as a literal historical account, since there are at least 19 other versions of the story that will use different language. In fact, the editors of the Bible didn't really mind that there were different creation stories, because if you read the verses that come right after our reading for this morning, you will discover a different creation story that describes the creation in a very different way, in a totally different order. And that creation story comes from a different layer that was probably written much earlier than the layer that gave us Genesis 1. Today's reading is probably the best known creation story from the Bible. It is a carefully structured story, and for those of us who remember the book of Revelation from the last several weeks, and I know some of you are desperately trying to forget, but in the book of Revelation, what was the organizing principle? The number 7. And what do we have in the Genesis story? Oh, the number 7 that organizes the story. The 7 days of the week determine the outline of the narrative. The first 3 days involve establishing the ordered creation, the sky, the sea, the land. The first day separates light from dark, creating the sky. The second day separates the water above from the water below, creating the seas. The third day separates land from the water, creating land and plants. And then the next 3 days populate those 3 areas of sky, sea, and land. Fourth day, we have the sky, the sun, and the moon, and the stars are created. The fifth day, in the seas, the fish and sea monsters are created. The sixth day, on the land, cattle, creeping things, and human beings are created. This structure reinforces the idea that the cosmos began as a dark and watery chaos that God brought light and order to. Notice we do not have a creation story from nothing here. Instead, rather, God created the world from a pre-existing chaos, a concept mirrored in many other ancient creation stories. And into this order, God creates human beings. Now notice that Genesis 1 places humankind at the end of the creation, signifying that humans are the apex of creation, created in the image of God. So this is all fine and dandy, but what does this all mean? Now, for a fundamentalist, they would tell you that this text is a history of how the world was created. For them, that is the point. If it isn't historical, it doesn't mean anything. But again, I would point out that there are several other creation stories in the Bible, and they don't agree with this one. That's important to keep in mind. So I think this means that this story is not meant to be taken as a literal or historical account. Now, in the vaguest of ways, we can make Genesis 1 kind of line up with our scientific theories, right? Light in the beginning, okay, there's the Big Bang. Water separating land, separating, okay, there's the planet Earth forming. Human beings are a fairly late comer to this planet, which does line up with the story. But to be fair, I think that tries to make the story function in a way that the writer almost certainly did not intend. The writer would not have understood our science. Notice how the sun, moon, and stars are likened to living beings, not chunks of rock or giant glowing orbs of plasma. If you read the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, you'll notice that the writer of Genesis 1 was borrowing details from that story, but making significant changes as well. So I don't think they intended us to take this story as a literal historical account of how the world came into being. And they wouldn't have really understood our science anyway. I think the writer is intentionally writing a story here, not an account. So what are we to make of this story? Well, I think that the one big point of this creation story is brought up again and again. At the end of each creative act, God declares that it was good. Light, the dry land, plants, sea creatures, birds, land animals, human beings, each declared good. And at the end, the text uses the phrase, very good. So first and foremost, we must see creation as good. And that is not something all religious traditions uphold. Heck, even some Christians seem to question the goodness of creation. But if we take this story seriously, though not literally, we need to acknowledge that creation is good. So that is important theological underpinning of what I'm going to say next, because I think for us, though, the main point is our role as human beings. In the Enuma Elish, again, the Babylonian creation story, human beings are created because the gods are lazy and they don't want to work. So they create humans as their slaves to do the work that they don't want to do. But that is not so for humans in Genesis 1. We are given a job to do, but we are nobody's slaves. The writer says that humans are given dominion over the earth, a line that unfortunately does get us into some trouble these days when we forget that biblical dominion also requires good behavior on behalf of those ruled. But nevertheless, an important role, a central role. And we are created in the image of God. Now, in the ancient world, kings were often understood to have the image of the god or gods. But here that image, that language is democratized. All human beings bear the image of God. All humans have reason. All humans have basic dignity. All humans have authority from God. That is not confined to some ruling elite. And that brings me to this call to action. The creation is good, and we human beings have a responsibility to keep it good. Because we all bear the image of God, we all share in that responsibility. We keep it good by caring for our planet's life, plants and animals and ecosystems. We keep it good by acting with love and justice for one another, creating and maintaining and restoring healthy communities where each person's dignity is affirmed and the goodness of God's creation is reaffirmed. And we do that by educating ourselves about this world. We do that so that we do what we can within our means to create, to maintain, to restore the goodness of the world. And we do that by advocating in areas where we can't actually do something to create, maintain, and restore. So to sum up, God created the world good, so let's keep it that way. And that is the message I want for you to be considering and carrying with you this week. Despite all appearances, despite the challenges of this world, God created this world good. And God endowed us with the ability to protect, to care for, to govern this world on behalf of God. When God says have dominion, God means for us to function as God's regent, God's steward, God's caretaker. The world is a good place, but there's a lot of things that happen in this world that aren't good. And it's our job to do what we can to overcome that. This is a good world, a good creation, despite what some might think. So let's keep it that way. Amen.